These are dark days, and we have darker days ahead. Bishop Athanasius Schneider has stated that we currently live through a catastrophe rivaling that of the Arian crisis. Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI has grimly predicted that the Church will be more faithful, but much, much smaller in the decades to come. There is a real crisis in the Church, a crisis that is shaking her to her core. Dissident priests and indifferent bishops allow the unchecked spread of un-Catholic beliefs among the laity. The average Catholic is ignorant or couldn't care less about his salvation. At churchmilitant.com, we have dedicated our lives to fighting and exposing this crisis. And while we understand the strong emotions that come with these trying times, there is a right and a wrong way to react to the chaos. For those who aren't familiar with them, the Society of St. Pius X is a group of Catholics who object to the Second Vatican Council. The Society of St. Pius X, or SSPX, are a fraternity of priests famous for wholly embracing the trappings of the traditional liturgy. Those who attend their masses are staunchly orthodox on nearly every point of church doctrine. A great many are outstanding Catholics. It's as if this is just the kind of medicine the Church has been needing for some time. But the word from the Vatican is less than promising. Pope Benedict XVI declared, "Until the doctrinal questions are clarified, the Society has no canonical status in the Church and its ministers. Even though they have been freed of the ecclesiastical penalty, do not legitimately exercise any ministry in the Church." There's a very real temptation to split the Church in two to try to make sense of all the chaos, to try and separate the mystical body of Christ from an often corrupt and indifferent hierarchy. But there is no distinction between the ideal Church and the Church of reality. This error was explicitly condemned by Pius XII. The true Church of Christ is not some eternal Rome. It is to the visible and tangible Church that exists today that we owe our loyalty and our reverence. The Society has some legitimate grievances and concerns. However, their tactics are unhelpful and in some cases even accidentally sabotage efforts to effect change in the Church. The SSPX's observations are correct, but their conclusions are too simplistic and incomplete. While Vatican II is said to contain ambiguities, the SSPX claims it teaches error. While many abuses occur at Novus Ordo Masses, the SSPX go after the Missal itself. Despite good intentions, the SSPX has become part of the problem. Consider this program as an invitation. Leave the SSPX, come back to full communion, and fix the crisis from within the Church, not outside of it. Our intention here is not to condemn, but to enlighten the many good and faithful people who assist at SSPX Masses. Christ himself foresaw corruption in the Church and the temptation to break away and start anew when things go wrong. Before we begin to analyze the case of the SSPX, let us reflect on Christ's words. "The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while men were sleeping, his enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat and went away. So when the plants came up and bore grain, then the weeds appeared also. And the servants of the household came and said to him, 'Sir, did you not sow good seed in your field? How then has it weeds?' He said to them, 'An enemy has done this.' The servants said to him, 'Then do you want us to go and gather them?' But he said, 'No, lest in gathering the weeds you root up the wheat along with them. Let both grow together until the harvest, and at harvest time I will tell the reapers, gather the weeds first and bind them into bundles to be burned, but gather the wheat into my barn.'" The SSPX was founded with the best of intentions. The founder of the Society of St. Pius X was Archbishop Michael Lefebvre. A former missionary in Africa, he was concerned about the effects of the heresy of modernism on the Church. In 1970, several French seminarians who had been drummed out of their priestly formation for their traditional beliefs by dissident rectors approached Lefebvre for help. After some deliberation, Lefebvre decided to teach them personally. To do so, he set up a religious society and named it the Society of St. Pius X, or the SSPX. The SSPX received a temporary canonical or legal status from the Bishop of Geneva for a 6-year trial. This is a normal procedure for a new organization. Not everyone was pleased with the founding of the SSPX, least of all the very heterodox French bishops. In 1974, after a canonical visitation gone sour, Lefebvre published a declaration where he denounced the modernist and Protestant influences he believed were present in the Church. He went a step further and blasted the current hierarchy and the Second Vatican Council itself. Denouncing modernism and Protestantism is commendable, but criticizing an ecumenical council and questioning the authority of the Pope publicly as a bishop is an entirely different matter. Archbishop Lefebvre has signed the Vatican II documents, despite the fact that he had the option not to. He had even signed for a fellow bishop who had given him power of attorney. But in the years since the council, the excesses of the dissidents had embittered him. His opponents seized this chance, and after a series of tense meetings with the local bishops, along with several cardinals, the SSPX eventually had its status withdrawn and was canonically suppressed by the local bishop. Lefebvre appealed to the Apostolic Signatura, the highest court in the Church, which decided to maintain the suppression, upholding the ruling of the local bishop. To make matters even more concrete, Blessed Pope Paul VI himself upheld the suppression. The SSPX's temporary canonical status expired in 1976 and was not renewed. At this point, there can be no doubt that the SSPX was validly suppressed. Even if one rejects the process due to procedural problems, the SSPX had only received a temporary canonical status, which has long since expired. From this point on, the SSPX was no longer recognized as a legitimate organization by the Holy See. Since then, the Church has taken a stance best summed up in Pope Benedict XVI's words, "The Society has no canonical status in the Church, and its ministers, even though they have been freed of the ecclesiastical penalty, do not legitimately exercise any ministry in the Church." Archbishop Lefebvre had a choice in front of him: either obey a valid ruling or do what he felt in his own opinion was right and begin to act in defiance of the Church. In the end, he chose the latter, claiming the process was rigged by modernist clerics. This is in stark contrast to the examples set by the Jesuits in the 18th century. It has been universally accepted that when Pope Clement XIV shut down the Jesuit order, it was unjust. However, rather than operate in defiance, they dispersed immediately without question. St. Padre Pio provides another example of obedience put to the test. St. Pio was unjustly censored and stripped of his ministry to a large degree. Rather than disobeying his superior, he humbly accepted the unfair but legal ruling of his bishop. St. Pio also rebuked his sister for leaving her order due to liberal reforms, saying, quote, "They are wrong and you are right, but still you must obey. You must return." St. Mary MacKillop was invalidly excommunicated, but accepted her punishment with humility. God always provides, and within a few years, both were vindicated. These examples illustrate how a saint deals with an unjust sentence from a superior. The SSPX claims that the example of St. Athanasius is their model for their resistance, but even this case does not apply. St. Athanasius was a 4th century bishop of Alexandria, famous for his stand against Arianism. Just for review now, Arianism is the belief that Christ was not divine, eternal, and equal to the Father. The chaos that swept the world during the Arian crisis is unequaled in church history. St. Jerome writes, "The world groaned to find itself Arian." The vast majority of bishops embraced the heresy, but St. Athanasius was not among them. He refused to bow to Arianism and was exiled 5 times by his enemies, who were entrenched in the church hierarchy. Athanasius' stand earned him the name the Father of Orthodoxy. The SSPX story alleges that the Arian Emperor Constantius seized Pope Liberius and had him tortured into condemning Athanasius. St. Athanasius reportedly rejected the excommunication of Pope Liberius based on the fact that Liberius was being tortured by the Arians and was under duress. There are some parallels in the SSPX version of events with the life of Lefebvre. They claim that the post-conciliar popes are like Pope Liberius, and that Lefebvre was like Athanasius. They see Lefebvre as a modern-day Athanasius, and so Lefebvre's excommunication, just like the excommunication of Athanasius, is null. That's what they claim. However, there are some problems that immediately arise when you try to make that comparison. First of all, it's not even certain Liberius actually excommunicated Athanasius. Pope Liberius was lauded by one of his successors as a man, quote, who would die rather than blaspheme Christ, mere decades after Liberius died. St. John Paul II was not under duress. Besides, Lefebvre wasn't excommunicated by the Pope, but was excommunicated automatically, or late sententia, as we will explain later. St. John Paul II merely upheld the validity of the excommunication that Lefebvre incurred on himself. Even if Liberius excommunicated Athanasius, the two are apples and oranges. Heck, it's uncertain that Liberius excommunicated Athanasius in the first place. The evidence is overwhelming that the SSPX story is gross, presumably inadvertent, calumny of a Catholic saint. The SSPX version has Liberius signing bogus documents under pressure and torture from the Arians. The guilt or innocence of Liberius depends on several hotly contested letters which many claim were Arian forgeries. However, his actions before and after his exile indicate that he was a man willing to face great persecution for orthodoxy. When he returned from exile, he made no recantations, and none were asked for. He was embraced by the people of Rome as if nothing had happened. Liberius initiated a crackdown on the Arians, a crackdown so brutal that even semi-Arian bishops were sacked. The 1910 Catholic Encyclopedia describes a defiant Pope Liberius dragged in front of Emperor Constantius, and when told to condemn Athanasius, Liberius refused. The enraged emperor shouted, "Who are you to stand up for Athanasius against the world?" To that, Liberius compared the emperor to Nebuchadnezzar and was banished to Dalmatia for his trouble. The phrase Athanasius against the world, or Athanasius contra mundum, is thrown around by the SSPX in their circles. But ironically, the phrase was first said by Emperor Constantius to taunt an obstinate Pope Liberius, who refused to turn on Athanasius. Awkwardly, even the SSPX's Sources of Catholic Dogma lists Pope Liberius as a saint. St. Ambrose, St. Basil, St. Epiphanius, St. Sirius, and Pope Anastasius I, all living during or close to that time period, list Liberius as a saint as well. Liberius is also recognized as a saint in the ancient Latin and Greek martyrologies. Pius IX and Benedict XV upheld Pope Liberius' innocence in recent times, and Liberius' feast day is currently celebrated by the Catholic Byzantine Rite. The SSPX claim an exception from the example set by the saints. The arguments given by the SSPX for Lefebvre's decision to defy the Church are a mass of accusations of unfairness, charges of corruption leveled at the Curia, and complaints of defects in procedure. This logic is a double appeal. It's like going to a court, hiring a lawyer, making your case, losing it, making your appeal, then losing that too, and after all of that drama, decide that the court didn't have the authority to make a judgment in the first place. We must stress this. The Church is a monarchy. Authority does not lie in a code of laws, but rather in a man, the Pope, the successor of Peter, and to whom the Pope delegates authority. It doesn't matter who was whispering what into whose ear. Curial intrigue has no bearing on the legitimacy of a papal ruling. Opinions from the so-called majority of reputable canonists are just that, opinions. In the words of St. Augustine, when Rome has spoken, the case is closed. The Pope will answer to God, and God alone, for any lapses in judgment. The Pope forbade Lefebvre from ordaining priests after the suppression. Lefebvre proceeded anyway, and was automatically suspended from celebrating the sacraments as per canon or church law. After his suspension, any ordinations Lefebvre carried out were illicit, and the new priests also shared in his suspension. It's important to point out here that Lefebvre was not suspended by any member of the church hierarchy, but suspended himself automatically by his action. Paul VI issued a letter to Lefebvre condemning his private judgment regarding the Second Vatican Council. The letter reads, quote, "You want to convince the faithful that the proximate cause of the crisis is more than a wrong interpretation of the Council and that it flows from the Church itself. Moreover, you act as if you have a particular role in this regard. But the mission of discerning and remedying the abuse is first of all ours," closed quote. And by ours, he meant himself, the Pope. In that same letter, the Pope scolded Lefebvre harshly. He accused Lefebvre of hypocrisy, writing, quote, "You claim not even to be affected by the orders of the Pope, or by the suspension a divinis, as you lament subversion in the Church," closed quote. Paul VI went further, quote, "That is why, with the full consciousness of our duties, we say to you, brother, that you are in error, and with the full ardor of our fraternal love, as also with all the weight of our authority as the successor of Peter, we invite you to retract, to correct yourself, and cease from inflicting wounds upon the Church of Christ." The correspondence between Lefebvre and Paul VI would come to naught. Paul VI died in 1978, and Pope St. John Paul II continued to reach out to the SSPX. Throughout the 1980s, talks between the SSPX and the Holy See continued on and off, with Lefebvre doing what he felt was necessary, while the Pope tried to bring him back under the authority of the successor to Peter. The stalemate continued into the late 1980s. In 1988, Lefebvre was growing old and needed a successor. He petitioned Rome for permission to consecrate a bishop. Rome granted his request in exchange for acknowledging the authenticity of Vatican II and the Missal of Paul VI. Lefebvre also demanded that the new bishop be from the ranks of the SSPX. Rome agreed to this as well, and a pact was signed on May 5, 1988. But Lefebvre felt this wasn't soon enough. He almost immediately began to waver from his agreement. He thought the Vatican was burying him with delays, hoping that he would die soon. The question of consecrating bishops for the SSPX had come up before, and Lefebvre had always flatly denied that he would ever do such a thing. But the Archbishop was now more than 80 years old and feeling the pressure of age and over a decade of separation from Rome. Many in the society were also pushing hard for Lefebvre to take that step. Lefebvre announced that he was going to reject the agreement and consecrate 4 bishops. Pope St. John Paul II issued a formal canonical warning and wrote a personal note begging Lefebvre not to carry out the consecrations. Again, it's important to note here that the appointing of bishops is a power reserved to the Pope, which is delegated out to bishops via an apostolic mandate. This was spelled out specifically by Pius XII in his encyclical on communism and the Church in China, released on June 29, 1958. Consecrating bishops outside of papal authority incurs automatic excommunication according to Canon 1382, which reads, "Both the bishop who, without a pontifical mandate, consecrates a person, a bishop, and the one who receives the consecration from him incur a late sententiae excommunication reserved to the apostolic see." Since the hierarchy of the Church is of divine origin, by circumventing it, one commits a very grave sin. Thus, the Church deals with the offenders with the harshest penalty. It has been said that to consider oneself indispensable to the faith means one does not believe himself to be an unprofitable servant of the Lord. But the combination of age, stress, and external pressure had caused Lefebvre to come unglued from Christ's words. But Lefebvre claimed there was a grave necessity due to a state of emergency. He believed that only the SSPX could save the Church, and if it died out, the faith would become extinct. He invoked a canonical principle known as epikeia. This principle says that the highest of laws is the salvation of souls. Lefebvre considered the SSPX to be the Church's lifeline. In his view, without a successor, the faith would be lost. Epikeia states that in an emergency situation which the legislator of canon law, who is the Pope, could not foresee, human laws could be suspended. In an underground church persecuted by communists, a dying bishop may not have communication with the Pope. The bishop can presume that the Pope would consent to ordaining his successor. In this circumstance, epikeia can be used to consecrate a successor. But epikeia did not apply to the 1988 consecrations because the principle relies on presumed consent on the part of the Pope. However, in Lefebvre's situation, the Pope had explicitly given an order not to consecrate bishops. By appointing bishops not only without but against apostolic mandate, he claimed papal prerogative regardless of what he said. By taking that power through his actions, Lefebvre would be setting himself up as a rival pope in deed, whether or not he denied it in word. Lefebvre consecrated the bishops anyway. By doing this, Lefebvre excommunicated himself automatically, in the same manner as someone who procures an abortion is excommunicated automatically. The 4 bishops he consecrated were also excommunicated automatically. Among those he consecrated was a 30-year-old priest, 5 years below the legal age for consecration. Pope St. John Paul II shortly thereafter released a statement confirming the excommunications publicly. It is critical to remember this. St. John Paul II did not excommunicate Lefebvre. Consecrating bishops without a mandate is a crime so heinous that the person excommunicates himself. The SSPX fired back in an open letter written by the 24 district superiors of the SSPX, quote, "We have never wished to belong to this system that calls itself the conciliar church. To be excommunicated by a decree of your eminence would be the irrefutable proof that we do not. We ask for nothing better than to be declared excommunione, excluded from impious communion with infidels." Closed quote. From this point on, the illicitly ordained clergy of the society have been operating in parallel to the Church, opening chapels and justifying their existence by citing its own personal interpretation of canon law. Lefebvre died excommunicated in 1991, and one of the bishops he illicitly consecrated, Bernard Fillet, became Superior General of the Society in 1994. In 2009, reconciliation seemed close, and in a gesture of peace, Pope Benedict XVI lifted the excommunications on the 4 living bishops. Lefebvre's excommunication, however, remained. It has never been lifted. Unfortunately, the talks fell through, and the SSPX remains separated. Pope Benedict XVI, in a definitive statement to the bishops of the world, defined their situation thusly: "The Society has no canonical status in the Church and its ministers, even though they have been freed of ecclesiastical penalty, do not legitimately exercise any ministry in the Church." The SSPX claims that Lefebvre's consecrations were permissible, and he was not excommunicated due to canon law because deep down inside, Lefebvre truly believed what he was doing was necessary. Many cardinals and prelates have chimed in with their 2 cents and opinions regarding the SSPX, but the definitive document on the SSPX was issued by Pope Benedict in 2009. In a letter to the bishops of the world, Pope Benedict explained his reasons for lifting the excommunications. First, let's talk about what his letter does not do. Benedict makes it clear that he lifted the excommunications as a mercy. It was not some kind of retroactive exoneration. Rather, it was a pardon. Furthermore, the only excommunications lifted were for those bishops, those 4 bishops, who were still alive. Michael Lefebvre's excommunication is in effect to this day. The lifting of the excommunications also has no bearing on the canonical situation itself. Pope Benedict's letter did not grant canonical status to the society. Pope Benedict decided to lift the excommunications as a peace overture. This overture was not returned, and the talks fell apart. The Holy Father makes it clear that the reason the Church and the SSPX were not able to reconcile was because of doctrinal issues. Full reunion with Rome during the 2009 talks was contingent on Bishop Lefebvre signing a doctrinal preamble on behalf of the SSPX. Lefebvre was unable to do so. Pope Benedict's letter goes on. The fact that the Society of St. Pius X does not possess a canonical status in the Church is not, in the end, based on disciplinary, but on doctrinal reasons. As long as the Society does not have a canonical status in the Church, its ministers do not exercise legitimate ministries in the Church. There needs to be a distinction then between the disciplinary level, which deals with individuals as such, and the doctrinal level at which ministry and institution are involved. In order to make this clear once again, until the doctrinal questions are clarified, the Society has no canonical status in the Church and its ministers, even though they have been freed of the ecclesiastical penalty, do not legitimately exercise any ministry in the Church. In light of this situation, it is my intention henceforth to join the Pontifical Commission Ecclesia Dei, the body which has been competent since 1988 for those communities and persons who, coming from the Society of St. Pius X or from similar groups, wish to return to full communion with the Pope, to the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. This will make it clear that the problems now to be addressed are essentially doctrinal in nature and concern primarily the acceptance of the Second Vatican Council and the post-conciliar magisterium of the popes. In the first paragraph, the SSPX is shown to have no legitimate ministry or canonical status. The Holy Father felt that this was so important that he restates it to drive the point home. The SSPX's lack of canonical status brings with it some harrowing effects. Once again, Pope Benedict has declared in his letter to the bishops of the world that the SSPX has no legitimate ministry. Without this legitimacy, the SSPX has no jurisdiction granted to it by the papacy. This means that the SSPX priests cannot grant absolution in the confessional. The SSPX also cannot perform the sacrament of marriage validly. People who have been married by the SSPX, in a word, aren't. Allow me to repeat this for clarity. This is a huge point. SSPX priests do not have faculties to hear confessions and give absolution for sins. They cannot serve as a witness for the Church of a sacramental marriage, period. Starting a family or finding spiritual healing within the SSPX is simply not going to happen. The SSPX offers sacraments under false pretenses, a heinous, heinous crime. If you've been married in the SSPX, you have in fact not been. Have your marriage convalidated at once. The SSPX can perform confirmations validly, but they are also illegal, known in the Church as illicit. Whenever they do so, they defy the Council of Trent, which forbids the sacrament being carried out without the local bishop's approval. All public masses celebrated by the priests of the SSPX are technically valid, but illicit or illegal, and are done in defiance of the Church and the Vicar of Christ, in disobedience. Even though the SSPX are known for following the rubrics of the Mass scrupulously, an illicit Mass is a terrible abuse that rivals anything carried out in a modernist parish. In regard to sin, celebrating an illicit Mass is at least a grave matter for the celebrant, for the priest. If celebrated with full knowledge and deliberation, it is mortally sinful. The SSPX also holds annulment tribunals to determine if marriages were validly contracted. This is a blatant usurpation of the local bishop's authority, as only he has the power legally to erect a tribunal. If you've had a decree of nullity issued by the SSPX, seek a priest or canon lawyer immediately, especially if you have remarried. The SSPX fraudulence is putting souls at risk. Lefebvre's excuse for these crimes is the claim that the Church itself is in a state of emergency, declared by his own authority, naturally, and therefore he could celebrate the sacraments licitly. According to him, due to the emergency, jurisdiction is supplied to him automatically by the Church. This whole state of emergency is ironically a symptom of modernism, as it is an arbitrary and subjective discarding of the Church's laws. Lefebvre looked around and saw abuses and corrupt clergy and therefore decided by himself that there was a state of emergency. Likewise, this state of emergency ends whenever he or his successors decides it does. Once again, to the SSPX, to the priest of the SSPX, private interpretation of tradition trumps the mind of the Church. How do you tell that there is an emergency? What specific trigger, if any, is present? It's not in canon law, so the parameters are totally, well, up to you. And what's the end game? How do you know when the emergency is over? When a good pope is elected, quote, good pope? How do you know when he's good? Do you watch him and decide afterwards? What if he becomes bad? The second paragraph of Pope Benedict's letter has 2 points to consider. Quote, in light of the situation, it is my intention henceforth to join the Pontifical Commission Ecclesia Dei, the body which has been competent since 1988 for those communities and persons who, coming from the Society of St. Pius X or from similar groups, wish to return to full communion with the Pope, to the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. This will make it clear that the problems now to be addressed are essentially doctrinal in nature and concern primarily the acceptance of the Second Vatican Council and the post-conciliar magisterium of the popes. The SSPX is not in full communion. Benedict makes this clear by inviting the SSPX to full communion. Finally, and most importantly, the reason the SSPX remains separated and without legitimate authority is because they have doctrinal issues. To make this clear, the Pope merged the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, the Vatican's theological watchdog, with Ecclesia Dei, the commission given the job of receiving people defecting from the SSPX back to the faith. This is absolutely key. The SSPX claims to simply believe what the Church has always believed. According to the Pope, this is simply not the case. So what are the SSPX's doctrinal problems? It's a rude shock to many that such a traditional group may have doctrinal irregularities, but it's important to realize that the clergy of the SSPX, the priests, have no charism of infallibility. It simply relies on their leaders to be really smart. And while the SSPX is pretty good most of the time, the SSPX denies the indefectibility of the Church. The SSPX repeatedly states that the Novus Ordo Missal is inherently toxic to the faith. Not just the many abuses that are carried out in far too many parishes, not talking about those, but the actual missal itself, the Mass. They go as far to say that attending it can be a sin and forbid those who go to their chapels to participate in it. To drive home the difference, they often refer to the Novus Ordo as the new Mass and the Tridentine liturgy as the Mass for all time. It is important to understand the concept of an old Mass and a new Mass, that this is completely false. There is only one sacrifice, one Mass. To say otherwise is heresy. What the SSPX hopefully means to describe is a new liturgy. Unfortunately, their language is ambiguous, imprecise, and reflects poor sacramental theology. The SSPX is correct in saying that there is the Mass of all time, but only insofar as Christ died once for our sins, and that every Mass of every liturgy is a representation of the one sacrifice. Christ's passion exists outside of time. Think of it as showing up to a never-ending sacrifice over and over again, dressed in different ways. The Church used to have many more liturgies than she does now. But in the 16th century, Pope St. Pius V promulgated Quo Primum, a papal letter that mandated the use of the Pius V Missal in all churches with some exceptions. The SSPX therefore refers to the Tridentine liturgy as the Mass of all time, or to restate it more correctly, the liturgy of all time. To cite quo primum as an argument against the Novus Ordo is the height of hypocrisy, and Blessed Paul VI himself even pointed this out. The SSPX priests themselves don't even use the Missal of Pius V. The Missal has been changed many times over the centuries. They use the Missal of St. John the 23rd from 1962, which has several differences with the so-called Mass of all time, or rather liturgy of all time, put forward 500 years ago. But is the SSPX interpretation of the document true? The answer is absolutely not. Exceptions were built into the letter for liturgies older than 200 years. Furthermore, many Catholics belong to the 22 separate rites in the Catholic Church, all of which have their own liturgy, just like the Roman Rite or the Latin Rite. For something to be dogmatic, it must be binding on all Catholics in all places and all times universally. There was never a point where the entire Church was obligated to use the Pius V's Missal. Quo primum is not dogmatic. Also bear in mind that equals cannot bind each other. As the chief liturgist in his own era, Blessed Pope Paul VI was well within his rights to promote his own missal by virtue of the very same authority that Pius V put forward in quo primum. Blessed Paul VI sums up this principle in a letter to Lefebvre, quote, "You say that you are subject to the Church and faithful to tradition by the sole fact that you obey certain norms of the past that were decreed by the predecessor of him to whom God today conferred the powers given to Peter. That is to say, on this point also, the concept of tradition you invoke is distorted. In short, it is absurd to appeal to the liturgical directives of a previous pope to decry the directives of a later one. This leaves us with the Novus Ordo as an approved liturgy of the Church, which is bad news for the priests of the SSPX. In the 22nd session of the Council of Trent, Canon 7 states the following, quote, "If anyone saith that the ceremonies, vestments, and outward signs, which the Catholic Church makes use of in the celebration of Masses, are incentives to impiety rather than offices of piety, let him be anathema." Close quote. This came 10 years before quo primum, when there were a plethora of liturgies. So we can discern quite easily the meaning of the Council Fathers. All validly approved liturgies enjoy this protection. Was the Novus Ordo Missal validly promulgated? The priests of the SSPX say no, because Protestants and characters such as Cardinal Bonini were involved in making it. But the argument flies in the face of Catholic tradition. The Church is a monarchy. It doesn't matter in the slightest who made the Missal. The legitimacy of it does not come from the process, but by the authority of the successor of Peter. It's the signature of the Vicar of Christ that makes it binding and nothing else. As a validly promulgated liturgy, the Novus Ordo falls well within the limits of this statute. So not only do the priests of the SSPX have it wrong, but every time a priest of the SSPX decries the Novus Ordo Missal itself, he's actually anathematizing himself. But the problems don't stop there. While the priests of the SSPX explicitly run afoul of Trent, they collide head-on with Vatican I. According to the First Vatican Council, the Church is unchangeable in her essence, including the liturgy. Should the priests of the SSPX claim to be true, the Church is now teaching error and leading others to evil, and her ordinary rite is a near occasion of sin. While the Pope can institute a perhaps inferior liturgy, it is impossible for him to institute one that by its very nature is evil. Some liturgies may be better than others, but all properly celebrated liturgies are sufficient for piety. This is dogma. The attacks on the indefectibility of the Church don't stop there, however. Although the official stance of the priests of the SSPX is that the new Mass is valid, the SSPX is far from reaching a consensus. Archbishop Lefebvre himself made the following statement, quote, "This union, which liberal Catholics want between the Church and the Revolution, is an adulterous union. Adulterous. This adulterous union can only beget bastards. Where are these bastards? They are the new rites. The new rite of the Mass is a bastard rite. The sacraments are bastard sacraments. We no longer know whether they are sacraments that give grace. We no longer know if this Mass gives us the body and blood of our Lord Jesus Christ. The priests emerging from the seminaries are bastard priests." Close quote. Other SSPX figures have chimed in every so often with the same opinion. However, this position is not orthodox, not even close. The Church as an institution cannot offer false sacraments or sacraments that lead one to sin. If this was the case, there could be no clear path to salvation, and grace has failed from the top down. The SSPX has also mythologized the history of the 20th century. The grounds for the SSPX rebellion are founded in its own interpretation of the Second Vatican Council. The SSPX story has St. John the 23rd's council being hijacked by modernists and neo-Protestants. However, the SSPX's version of history is incomplete and overstated. Unfortunately, the hurricane of apostasy that swept through the Church in the late 60s makes this interpretation extremely plausible. Many Catholics hear this and say, "Oh, they must be right because look at the destruction." The SSPX completely ignores the elemental and vital role of the Eastern Catholic rites at the Council and since. First, we need to establish what an Eastern Rite Catholic is. Eastern Rite Catholics are not members of the Orthodox Church. While the vast majority of all Catholics follow the Roman or the Latin Rite, millions of faithful Catholics are in other rites. These rites also submit to the Pope and are in full communion, yet use Greek and various other languages in their liturgy. However, these rites began to feel more and more ignored by Rome in the first half of the 20th century. The SSPX routinely behave as if the other 22 rites don't exist at all, despite the fact that they offer valid Masses in a traditional form. Even if the Roman Rite collapses completely, the Church would continue to live on. Churches such as the Melkite Rite sought to preserve their traditions from what they felt was being forced on them, namely Roman traditions. At the beginning of the Council, Melkite Patriarch Maximos IV demanded a change in how the Church treated the smaller rites. To make a long story short, he got it. Many of the reforms the SSPX attribute to Protestantism actually spiraled out of a desire to accommodate the Eastern Catholic churches. Supporters of the SSPX claim that the SSPX has never been declared by the Church to be in a state of schism. This is untrue. In the letter St. John Paul II wrote confirming Lefebvre's excommunication, he referred to the SSPX as a separate church. Quote, "With great affliction, the Church has learned of the unlawful episcopal ordination conferred on the 30th of June last by Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre, which has frustrated all the efforts made during the previous years to ensure the full communion with the Church of the priestly fraternity of St. Pius X, founded by the same Monsignor Lefebvre." It gets worse. Quote, "In the present circumstances, I wish especially to make an appeal both solemn and heartfelt, paternal and fraternal, to all those who until now have been linked in various ways to the movement of Archbishop Lefebvre, that they may fulfill the grave duty of remaining united to the Vicar of Christ in the unity of the Catholic Church, and of ceasing their support in any way for that movement. Everyone should be aware that formal adherence to the schism is a grave offense against God and carries the penalty of excommunication decreed by the Church's law." Closed quote. Despite what some bishops and cardinals may have said off the cuff in interviews, and despite the legal recognitions made by secular governments like Argentina, the designation of the SSPX as a separate church has never been rescinded. Even with the lifting of the excommunications, that act only applies to the 4 individuals. The declaration made by John Paul II remains in force. Despite the claims of the present-day SSPX, there was plenty of talk of schism on the SSPX side as well. Lefebvre made numerous schismatic statements during his lifetime. Quote, "This council represents, in our view and in the view of the Roman authorities, a new church, which they call the conciliar church." Quote, "It is not we who are in schism, but the conciliar church." Homily preached at Lille, August 29, 1976, before a crowd of some 12,000. These words appear in the original, uncorrected version of the sermon as recorded and reported in the press. In 2008, Cardinal Hoyos has affirmed that the SSPX is at least not in formal schism, in the sense that they do not formally reject the authority of the Pope. He did, however, confirm that Marcel Lefebvre committed a schismatic act. A year later, Pope Benedict, the highest authority on the matter, he is the Pope, made clear in a declaration that the SSPX are not in, quote, full communion. Finally, in 2013, Cardinal Hoyos' successor and the legitimate judge of the SSPX case, Cardinal Mueller, confirmed in an interview that the SSPX are indeed in actual schism. The SSPX itself claims that it is in full communion. It is just merely disobedient in some matters. Recognize but resist is a commonly used expression in SSPX circles. Apologists for the SSPX will try to put forth the argument that you are not in schism unless you formally announce that you no longer recognize the Pope as your authority. This argument is completely fabricated. It has no base in canonical precedent and results from an extremely flawed notion of the Church's laws regarding full communion. Certain strains of high church Anglicanism consider themselves to be in full communion, but they're obviously not. If the SSPX argument is true, these clearly schismatic groups would also be in full communion. This principle has never been the understanding of the Church. In fact, the law regarding schism, Canon 751, doesn't even mention formally rejecting the Pope. In Canon 751, schism is defined as, quote, "the withdrawal of submission to the Supreme Pontiff or from communion with the members of the Church subject to him," closed quote. The laws of the Church do not differentiate between full or partial withdrawal of submission. In other words, any degree of disunity is disunity, and partial obedience is not somehow okay. Canon law isn't interested so much in what you say as how you behave. In the same way, you cannot get away with partial disobedience to God, you cannot get away with partial disobedience to his vicar. Imagine how absurd it would be for someone to say, "I'm a loyal servant of the Lord, I'm just disobedient in some matters." This distinction between full and partial disobedience is an invention of the SSPX and does not exist in the laws of the Church. Recognize but resist has never been good enough for the Church and has even been specifically proscribed as erroneous. According to Vatican I and Pius XII, several decades later, obedience must be in word and deed. The Pope has two primacies, his infallible teachings and his authority for the discipline and government of the Church. Submission to both are required for incorporation into the body of Christ, and anything less risks schism. Once again, adhering to the Pope's infallible teachings is not enough. You must accept and obey his authority in regards to church discipline and jurisdiction. Are the Pope's disciplinary rulings infallible? Well, of course not, and nobody says they are. But this is just a red herring. The Pope has a primacy over our will as well as our intellect. The SSPX acknowledges this primacy, but refuse to obey it, making them very vulnerable to the charge of schism. Like it or not, submission to the Pope's disciplinary rulings is a constitutive part of Catholicism. The SSPX certainly violates the first part of Canon 751, but they absolutely flunk the second. Remember, the Church defines separation as, quote, "the withdrawal of submission to the Supreme Pontiff or from communion with the members of the Church subject to him." Now, let's make this very clear. Regardless of your relationship with the Pope, breaking communion with the rest of the faithful, also in communion with the Pope, is enough by itself to make a charge of schism stick. Once more, for clarity, You can be a model of disciplinary obedience, a lion of orthodoxy, and carry out every exhortation to the letter. But if you separate yourself from the rest of those who are in communion with the Pope, you are in schism. There is no denying that the SSPX has withdrawn communion with the rest of the laity. They forbid members from attending not only the Novus Ordo, but the indult Tridentine Mass as well. They urge their members to defy the authority of their local bishop by telling those who attend their chapels to seek out their false annulment tribunals instead of the legitimate diocesan ones. This refusal to worship with the vast majority of Catholics under any circumstances is an absolute violation of Canon 751. This alone, even if they were in full allegiance to the Pope, and the laws of the Church insist they are not, is enough to be considered in schism. So what is the SSPX now, the society? The answer depends solely on whom you talk to. The clergy of the society don't represent a single school of theological thought. Rather, it is host to a spectrum of beliefs, from Catholics simply concerned about the state of the Church to full-blown sedevacantists. As a side note, a sedevacantist is someone so extreme in their rejection of Vatican II that they deny the Pope is actually the Pope, any Pope. The word sedevacantist comes from Latin meaning empty chair, referring to the throne of St. Peter. Sedevacantists believe that starting from Pope St. John the 23rd on, the throne of Peter has been empty all these 50, 60 years, since, in the Sedevacantists' own opinion, the popes since Vatican II were heretics. They could not have been true popes. That's what a Sedevacantist believes. The long and short of it is, like Protestantism, the SSPX is many things to many people, and often these views are irreconcilable. And nowhere is the diversity of opinion more apparent than in the SSPX hierarchy itself. Open defiance, numerous splits, and internal power struggles tell a striking tale of division. Multiple times, SSPX priests, sometimes even bishops, have returned to full communion or gone the other way and embraced Sedevacantism. Even during the time Lefebvre himself ran the society, there was not a universal agreement as to what the SSPX was or what its mission should be. Lefebvre did not help this situation. He never formally declared himself to be a Sedevacantist, but he made numerous comments that were ambiguous enough to confuse his followers. He made statements such as the following, quote, "While we are certain that the faith the Church has taught for 20 centuries cannot contain error, we are much further from absolute certitude that the Pope is truly Pope." He said those comments in Le Figaro on August 4th, 1976. Further, quote, "It is possible we may be obliged to believe this Pope is not Pope. For 20 years, Monsignor de Castromayor and I preferred to wait." He said that in a talk March 30th and repeated it April 18th, 1986, published in the Angelus, the SSPX paper, in July 1986. Several known Sedevacantists taught at his seminary, and his guide to traditional parishes included Sedevacantist churches. Early on, Lefebvre's post-suspension actions alienated a significant number of ultra-right traditionalists. They would later leave the SSPX to found a Sedevacantist group known as the Society of St. Pius V. This was due to claims of liturgical abuse and grievances regarding Lefebvre's expulsion of priests, as well as a perceived weakening of resolve against the Second Vatican Council. Lefebvre's beliefs regarding the state of emergency and the extent of the powers this emergency granted him was not shared by all. Many priests thought that Lefebvre went too far by manufacturing an apostolic mandate for himself. Immediately after the consecration of the bishops, the priestly fraternity of St. Peter, or FSSP, broke with the SSPX and was itself reconciled with Rome. The FSSP is a wholly acceptable alternative to the SSPX, fully recognized by the Church. It has canonical status and legitimate ministry. FSSP parishes offer the traditional Latin Mass. Others saw the reason for the Society's existence was to be a lifeboat for the traditional Latin Mass. When Benedict XVI granted sweeping permissions to celebrate the traditional Latin Mass in 2008, many saw no further reason to be separated from the Church. Groups such as the Transalpine Redemptorists left the SSPX and promptly re-entered into full communion. These three cases are not isolated incidents, they're simply examples. There have been many more splinter groups throughout the years. Nor are the disputes caused by a select group of rebels. Even among the four bishops, handpicked by Lefebvre himself, a consensus on what the SSPX's mission is can't be reached. The Superior General, Bishop Bernard Fillet, has shown willingness to make limited concessions to Rome. On the other side of the fence, Bishop Richard Williamson has staunchly resisted any kind of dialogue with Rome, clashed publicly with other bishops, and began to adopt a strong sedevacantist streak in his weekly messages, Eleison comments. Eventually, after years of disobedient behavior, Williamson was cast out of the SSPX by Bishop Fillet. Ironically, his crime was conferring the sacrament of confirmation without permission. Perhaps Williamson felt that there was a state of emergency that required him to act out of necessity. In any case, Williamson defiantly fired back with an open letter accusing Fillet of becoming conciliatory and asking that he resign. Thus, the four ordained by Lefebvre are now only three. Bishop Williamson went on to consecrate a bishop illicitly. The SSPX found themselves in the awkward position, catch this now, the awkward position of having to condemn Bishop Williamson for doing exactly what Lefebvre did almost 30 years earlier. The SSPX released a statement distancing itself from Bishop Williamson, but in the same statement still had to insist the original consecrations were legal and that the state of emergency that existed before still exists today. But apparently, they are the only ones who get to take advantage of it. As for the future of the SSPX, opinions are extremely varied. Bishop Fillet, after the failure of the 2009 talks with the Vatican, announced that it was not the time for reconciliation. This move upset both SSPX hardliners as well as those tired of being separated from Rome. The first seminarian ever ordained by Lefebvre into the society and one of the original members of the SSPX, Father Paul Alagnier, was kicked out of the society for straying from the party line. Father Alagnier had urged for a rapid end to the SSPX's separation from Rome. He was deeply concerned about a potential schism. His thesis was that the SSPX is entering its second and now third generation, and the youth have no memory of being in communion with Rome and may develop the idea that reconciliation is unnecessary. He was expelled after publishing the article. After seeing fit to expel Father Lagnier for his views, the SSPX has backpedaled. A recent editorial on SSPX.org parroted the views that the disgraced priest was expelled for just a year or two earlier. Now, this is a long quote, but bear with us, it's quite enlightening. Quote, "We've been living in independence from the Pope and the bishops for a very long time, as if that were normal. The Pope and the bishops are little by little confined to the realm of the beings of reason with no influence on concrete life. Rome is no more than a pilgrimage site, and the Church is a mystical body with Jesus Christ for a head, the Holy Ghost for a soul, and the trads for members. In these conditions, our children would no longer have any idea of what the real Church is in its full incarnation, from head to members in all the realities of daily life. As for authority, recognized in principle but not admitted in fact as far as the Pope is concerned, it risks no longer being recognized at any degree whatsoever. Every superior runs the risk of being challenged, criticized even publicly, and even families will fall apart. Why obey a father who does not obey the Pope, the bishop, the priest? So which is it? Is it not the proper time for reconciliation, or is there an urgent need for reconciliation with Rome? Which is it? The SSPX words do not correspond to their deeds. The priests of the SSPX recklessly attack the Pope at every opportunity. Any perceived mistake or ambiguous statement is cited over and over again to justify its rebellion. One gets the impression that it's more interested in winning the argument with Rome than the damage such gossip causes. The SSPX needs to look to Scripture, where Ham is condemned for needlessly spreading word of the nakedness of Noah. Likewise, David would not raise his hand against King Saul, even though King Saul wanted to kill him. Why did David hold back? Because he did not want to raise his hand against the anointed one of God, even in self-defense. Even if you are in the right, you need to think long and hard about exactly what you are doing against the successor of Peter, not shoot from the hip. If you think about it, the SSPX's constructive criticism doesn't really do that much besides damage the Pope's credibility. The Pope, any Pope, is not just any leader like the President who can be lampooned without any real consequence. The Pope is different in that, just like a king, his office embodies the unity and the visible authority of the Church. In a very real way, when you attack the Pope, you run the risk of attacking the Church herself as well. The priests of the SSPX claim its contribution to preserve the sacraments in the traditional form, but the existence of the FSSP, as well as a rapidly growing traditionalist movement, and finally the motu proprio issued by Benedict XVI, make it rather irrelevant now in that regard. In Christ's parable of the talents, the servant who hid his talent certainly preserved it for posterity, but rather than being congratulated by his master, he was condemned. Having a perfect defense has never been enough. The church militant needs to be on the offensive. Faithful Catholics, real Catholics, are needed at the front lines, not sequestered away in local illicit chapels with their false sacraments. They need to be in the trenches, fighting the modernists in every diocese at point-blank range. If we don't take the fight to the enemy, how can we ever expect victory? Adopting a wait-and-see approach while hunkered down in your own insular congregations is a defeatist attitude. The SSPX likes to style itself as the champion for the Church. In reality, instead of fighting, it teaches desertion. It is cowardly to turn and flee the battle to take refuge in these safe havens when there's much work to be done to restore the Church. Sometimes it's not so clear-cut and people can be stuck between a rock and a hard place. They may have to care for handicapped family members or be deployed overseas. We're not asking that everyone join the parish council, but we do contend that even if it's only through prayer, there is something everyone can do, and leaving the Church is never the answer. To all those who attend SSPX Masses, we here at Church Militant ask you this: how can you possibly consider yourself a soldier of Christ if you don't go out and be a light to all who are in darkness? How can you grow in faith without the healing power of confession? No, the real defenders of tradition are the faithful Catholics abandoned by those fleeing to their safe havens. These are the outstanding Catholic communities such as the FSSP, as well as many spiritually solid parishes, down to the faithful communities in less sound congregations. There are over 500 parishes that offer a weekly Latin liturgy in the United States alone, and thousands that celebrate the Novus Ordo liturgy reverently. Many claim that modernism is too dangerous, too infectious. The SSPX claims that the Novus Ordo, even when offered reverently with communion on the tongue, is a danger to your faith. But Christ never promised us a life of safety. Benedict XVI charges us with leaving our safe haven when he says, "The world offers you comfort, but you are not made for comfort, you are made for greatness." Let that greatness shine forth in your parish where it will do the most good, even if you have to suffer to do it. We'd like to end this with a quote from none other than St. Pius X himself. Quote, "Do not allow yourselves to be deceived by the cunning statements of those who persistently claim to wish to be with the Church, to love the Church, to fight so that people do not leave her. But judge them by their works. If they despise the shepherds of the Church and even the Pope, if they attempt all means of evading their authority in order to elude their directives and judgments, then about which church do these men mean to speak? Certainly not about that established on the foundation of the apostles and the prophets, with Christ Jesus himself as the cornerstone." We here at Church Militant would like to extend an appeal. If you are still in the Church, stay in it and continue the fight. We know it's tough. Believe us, we are in that fight every day. If you aren't in the church, come back and share your expertise, your holiness, your desire to love God. You are desperately needed at the front lines. God love you. I'm Michael Voris.